afford the basement apartment, I'll give you the penthouse." The real estate mogul sneered. Then the homeless man pulled out a paper that made her go pale. "Before we continue, please comment on which country you're watching from. Subscribe to this YouTube channel for more stories." The polished granite floors of Sterling Tower reflected the afternoon sunlight, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's most exclusive neighborhood. Mercedes and Teslas lined the circular driveway, where uniformed valets attended to residents who treated luxury as an entitlement rather than a privilege. Among them, a figure stood out like a stain on silk. Thomas Gray shuffled through the pristine lobby in shoes held together with duct tape, his weathered jacket bearing the unmistakable marks of too many nights sleeping rough. His calloused hands clutched a manila folder that had seen better days, its edges frayed and softened by time and careful preservation. His gray beard was neatly trimmed despite his circumstances, a small dignity maintained against overwhelming odds. Every detail of Sterling Tower whispered of wealth that Thomas had never known: imported Italian fixtures, designer furniture that cost more than most people's cars, abstract art worth six figures hanging casually in the corridors. The building's chrome and glass aesthetic created an atmosphere of cold perfection that seemed designed to repel anyone who didn't belong to the 1%. At the leasing office, Victoria Sterling commanded attention without effort. The real estate mogul stood imperiously behind her desk in a dove-gray suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her perfectly manicured nails drumming impatiently on her leather desk pad. At 35, she had built an empire that spanned 5 cities, transforming her father's modest property business into a billion-dollar portfolio of luxury developments. Her ice-blue eyes held the calculating sharpness of someone who viewed people as either assets or obstacles. As Thomas approached, conversations in the lobby seemed to halt. Residents exchanged disgusted glances and whispered comments about those people invading their sanctuary. The contrast was jarring and deliberate, privilege and poverty colliding in a space designed to celebrate excess while erasing struggle. Neither Victoria nor Thomas could have imagined that this moment would shatter every assumption they held about ownership, justice, and the true meaning of home. In his worn folder lay documentation that would transform not just their afternoon, but the entire conversation about property rights, historical theft, and who really belongs. Thomas's heart pounded as he stepped into the leasing office. The subtle scent of expensive perfume and new leather created an atmosphere of exclusivity that made him acutely aware of how out of place he was. He had rehearsed this moment countless times during sleepless nights and shelters, but now facing the reality of Sterling Tower's intimidating luxury, his carefully planned words seemed inadequate. "Excuse me," he said quietly to the receptionist, his voice roughened by years of street living, but carrying an unexpected dignity. "I'd like to inquire about available apartments." The young woman behind the desk looked up with a professional smile that died instantly when she registered his appearance. Her gaze flickered between Thomas's threadbare clothing and the expensive leather chairs where wealthy prospective tenants typically sat. "I'm sorry, but all our units require extensive background checks and financial documentation," she said, her tone suggesting this was a gentle way of saying he should leave. "I understand," Thomas replied, his fingers tightening around his folder. "I'm prepared to provide whatever documentation you need. I'm particularly interested in your most affordable unit." A sharp laugh cut through the office air, and Thomas turned to find Victoria Sterling emerging from her private office, clearly having overheard the exchange. Her presence was magnetic in the way that only true power could be. Not just wealth, but the absolute confidence that came from never having been challenged in any meaningful way. "The most affordable unit?" Victoria repeated, her cultured voice dripping with barely concealed amusement. "Sir, do you have any idea what building you've wandered into?" The office had grown quieter, staff members pausing their work to watch the unfolding scene with a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment, but something deep inside him refused to retreat. "I know exactly where I am, ma'am," he replied, his voice growing steadier despite the tremor in his hands. This is Sterling Tower, built in 2018 on the former site of the Riverside neighborhood. Victoria's eyebrows arched with theatrical surprise. She gestured broadly to the opulent surroundings, the imported marble, the crystal light fixtures, the panoramic city views through walls of glass. "This is Sterling Tower," she announced, her voice carrying with the authority of ownership. "Our least expensive unit, a 600-square-foot basement apartment that barely qualifies as residential space, rents for $3,200 per month. That's before utilities, parking, or building fees." Gasps and nervous laughter rippled through the office. Several staff members had begun glancing at their phones, sensing they were witnessing something that might become interesting gossip. Thomas felt the weight of their judgment, their certainty that he was delusional or running some kind of scam. But instead of fleeing in humiliation, as Victoria clearly expected, he did something that surprised everyone in the office, including himself. He smiled. A small, knowing smile that carried decades of patient determination. $3,200 for your basement apartment," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "And you're suggesting I couldn't possibly afford that?" "I'm suggesting," Victoria said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "that someone in your circumstances might be more comfortable pursuing housing assistance through appropriate social services channels. We cater to a very specific clientele here." The cruelty in her words was wrapped in professional courtesy, but Thomas heard it clearly. He understood that his poverty was being used as evidence of his unworthiness, that his appearance automatically disqualified him from being taken seriously. But instead of arguing, Thomas reached into his folder with steady hands. $3,200 for your basement apartment," he said again, his voice taking on unexpected strength. "And if I can prove I have the right to be here, to live in any unit I choose, will you reconsider your assessment of my circumstances?" The confidence in his tone made Victoria pause. Around them, the office had fallen completely silent, staff and residents alike sensing that this strange confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. "Prove you're right." Victoria's professional smile faltered slightly. "Sir, property rights are established through rental agreements and financial qualifications, not through legal ownership," Thomas interrupted gently, pulling a document from his folder. "Through original deeds, land grants, and property transfers that some people thought could be buried under luxury towers and forgotten." The atmosphere in the office shifted. Curiosity replaced mockery. Victoria's assistant moved closer, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine interest. "My name," Thomas said clearly, "is Thomas Gray, but my grandfather's name was Henry Thompson Gray, the original owner of the 3-acre parcel on which Sterling Tower now stands." Victoria's confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The name Henry Thompson Gray triggered something in the recesses of her memory. A footnote in property records, a detail her lawyers had assured her was irrelevant. That's impossible," she stammered, though her voice lacked complete certainty. "This land was legally acquired through proper city development channels. All previous owners were fairly compensated according to market rates at the time." Thomas smiled again, that same knowing expression that unsettled her. Market rates determined by whom? Fair compensation negotiated under what circumstances? "My grandfather was 73 years old, ma'am. He lived alone in the house he built with his own hands in 1957. When your development company came calling with lawyers and eminent domain threats, he didn't have the resources to fight back." He carefully unfolded a document that looked like it had been carried for years, creased and softened by time, but meticulously preserved. The contrast between his humble appearance and the reverent way he handled this paperwork created odd tension in the air. "But before he died," Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving Victoria's increasingly pale face, "my grandfather made sure his grandson had proof. He made sure I had documentation of the original deed, the coerced sale, and the transfer agreement that promised his family continued rights to the property." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed without sound. The mathematics were suddenly, terrifyingly clear in her mind. If this man's claims had any validity, then her crown jewel property, the flagship development that had established a reputation as a visionary developer, might be built on legally questionable foundations. That's preposterous, she managed, though the conviction was draining from her voice. Our lawyers, our title insurance, the city planning commission, everything shows clear ownership through proper legal channels. Thomas held out his document, and even from several feet away, Victoria could see official stamps, careful handwriting, and signatures that looked authentic enough to survive legal scrutiny. Records can be cleared when developers have connections and elderly property owners don't, Thomas said quietly, especially when those property owners die shortly after being forced to sell at prices far below market value. He produced another paper, a death certificate. My grandfather, Henry Thompson Gray, died for months after being forced to sell his property. Heart attack, the official record says. Broken heart from losing the home he'd built and maintained for 60 years is what I say. The explosion of uncomfortable murmurs that erupted through the office was like a dam bursting. Staff members who had been smirking at the homeless man were now seeing him through completely different eyes. So yes, Miss Sterling, Thomas said softly, his voice carrying across the silent office like a bell, I would like to discuss renting an apartment. Because according to these documents, my family never legally surrendered ownership of this land, which means your entire building stands on property that still belongs to the Gray family estate. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, watching her carefully constructed empire begin to crack before her eyes. The Sterling Tower leasing office erupted into controlled chaos as the implications of Thomas's revelation rippled through the space like seismic waves. Staff members who moments before had been dismissing him as a delusional vagrant were now frantically whispering among themselves, their phones capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming a corporate crisis. Victoria stood paralyzed, her usually sharp mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The document Thomas held seemed to mock her with its aged authenticity. Every water stain, every careful fold, every official seal telling a story that could potentially destroy everything she had built. This is absurd, she finally managed, though her voice lacked its earlier authority. You can't just walk in here with some old papers and claim ownership of a $200 million property. There are procedures, legal processes, statute of limitations. You're absolutely right, Thomas interrupted calmly, his demeanor shifting from humble supplicant to confident advocate. There are legal processes, and I've been following them meticulously for the past 4 years. The crowd of office workers and curious residents pressed closer, sensing that this confrontation was far from over. Several people had begun live-streaming the encounter, and notifications of shares and comments were creating a rising chorus of digital attention. Thomas reached into his worn backpack, the kind homeless people carried their entire lives in, and withdrew a series of folders that looked considerably more official than his humble appearance suggested. These are copies of the complaint I filed with the County Property Records Office 3 years ago, he said, producing documents with official stamps and file numbers. This is the genealogical documentation proving my direct descent from Henry Thompson Gray. And this, he held up a thick legal brief, is the notice of claim that was served to Sterling Development Corporation 18 months ago. Victoria's face went from pale to ashen. The mention of served legal notices cut through her shock like ice water. What notice? She demanded, though a memory was stirring. A conversation with her legal team that she had dismissed as routine nuisance litigation. The notice documenting the coerced sale of my grandfather's property in 2017. Thomas explained matter-of-factly. The one detailing how Sterling Development used city connections to expedite eminent domain proceedings while offering 60% below market value. The one your legal team apparently decided wasn't worth troubling you with because they assumed a homeless man with a public defender couldn't pose a real threat. The truth hit Victoria like a physical blow. She did remember now a brief email from her head counsel about some descendant making claims about the Riverside property. Her lawyers had assured her it was nonsense, the kind of desperate lawsuit that property developers faced regularly from people trying to squeeze settlements. She had instructed them to handle it quietly and had promptly forgotten about it. "You've been planning this," she said slowly, her business acumen finally catching up to her emotional shock. "This entire encounter, coming here in those clothes, asking to rent an apartment, letting me humiliate you in front of my staff, it was all calculated." Thomas's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of the pain beneath his strategic planning. Not planned exactly, but hoped for. "You see, Miss Sterling, I've been trying to get a meeting with you for over 3 years. Your assistants, your security, your lawyers, they all made it very clear that someone like me would never get past the lobby of your corporate headquarters." He gestured to his threadbare clothing with a self-deprecating gesture. "So I decided to come as myself. No lawyers, no formal appointments, no intermediaries. Just a homeless man with a story you needed to hear. Because despite what your legal team told you, this isn't going away. Property rights don't expire just because the rightful owner becomes inconvenient." Jennifer Martinez, Victoria's operations director, appeared at her boss's side, her face pale with the implications of what she was overhearing. "Ma'am," she whispered urgently, "perhaps we should continue this conversation in your private office. People are recording everything, and this could become a public relations catastrophe." But Thomas heard her clearly. "Actually, I think the public nature of this conversation is important," he said, addressing the growing crowd as much as Victoria. "Because this isn't just about legal ownership. It's about something much bigger." He turned to face the gathered residents and staff, many of whom were still filming, their expensive jewelry and designer clothes creating a stark tableau of privilege. "How many of you assumed I didn't belong here because of how I look?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying unexpected authority. "How many of you thought it was entertaining to watch someone mock a homeless man trying to inquire about housing?" Uncomfortable shifts rippled through the crowd. Several people lowered their phones, suddenly aware that they had been complicit in what was beginning to look like a profound misjudgment. This building was constructed on land that belonged to working-class families, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. Families who were pushed out, intimidated by legal threats, offered pittances for properties they'd maintained for generations. My grandfather wasn't some random obstacle to progress. He was a Korean War veteran who built his home with his own hands, who raised his family there, who contributed to this community for 60 years before developers decided his neighborhood would be more valuable as luxury condos. Victoria found her voice again, though it came out strained. "Even if your claims have merit, even if there was some questionable dealing in the original property acquisition, that was 7 years ago. Adverse possession, good faith improvements, development investments, there are countless legal principles that would protect our ownership." "You're right about the complexity," Thomas acknowledged. "But here's what your lawyers didn't tell you. The original deed to my grandfather's property included specific clauses about family succession and inheritance rights. And my grandfather was very careful about documentation, probably because he'd seen too many of his fellow veterans lose their homes to unscrupulous developers during the first wave of gentrification in the 1990s. He pulled out another document, this one a photocopy of a handwritten letter covered in careful script. "This is a letter my grandfather wrote to me when he was in hospice, explaining the property history and telling me exactly how to pursue my family's rights if anything happened to the land after his death. He knew that poor people's property claims have a way of disappearing when they become inconvenient for the wealthy." The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the building. Residents from upper floors had come down to witness the unprecedented scene, and even some of Victoria's corporate team had arrived, drawn by urgent messages from staff. Victoria's phone began buzzing insistently. Glancing at it, she saw multiple calls from her legal team, her publicist, and her board of directors. Word was already spreading beyond the building's walls, and the implications were staggering. "What do you want?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Money? A settlement? What's your endgame here?" Thomas smiled sadly. "I want justice, Miss Sterling. Not just for my family, But for all the families who were erased from this neighborhood's history when you decided their homes would be more profitable as luxury housing, I want acknowledgement that wealth doesn't give you the right to erase people's lives. And I want to transform this place into something that actually serves the community it displaced. The word transform hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the sterile lobby, with its cold perfection, suddenly seemed less like a monument to success and more like a tombstone marking buried histories. "You're talking about destroying everything I've built," Victoria said, though her tone had shifted from anger to something approaching fear. "I'm talking about building something better," Thomas replied. "Something that honors both my grandfather's legacy and your architectural vision. Something that proves luxury and community don't have to be enemies. They can be partners in creating real value." As he spoke, Thomas's transformation from dismissed vagrant to visionary advocate was complete. The crowd could see it. Victoria could feel it. And the implications were reverberating far beyond the walls of Sterling Tower. The tension in Sterling Tower's lobby had reached a critical mass when Jennifer Martinez stepped forward with the practiced efficiency that had made her invaluable to the Sterling Empire. Her polished demeanor and crisis management instincts were armor against the chaos threatening to engulf the building. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with forced calm, "I think we should move this discussion to a more private, without witnesses." Thomas interrupted gently but firmly. "Without documentation of what happens when someone challenges the comfortable narrative that keeps this system running?" The live streams on social media were multiplying exponentially. Hashtag Sterling Tower Truth was already trending as videos of the confrontation spread across platforms. The building's reputation for exclusive, scandal-free luxury living was crumbling in real time, replaced by something far more complex and uncomfortable. Victoria's phone continued its relentless assault of notifications. Her head of legal affairs had sent 5 urgent messages in the past 15 minutes. Her father, the retired patriarch who had started the family business, had sent a terse text. "What the hell is happening?" "Mr. Gray," Victoria said, realizing she had been so focused on dismissing him that she hadn't even properly learned his name. "These are serious allegations with far-reaching implications. If there's any validity to your claims, it would require extensive legal review, historical verification, property assessment. All of which I'm prepared for," Thomas cut in smoothly. "My legal team has been building this case for 4 years. We have original property records, transfer documents, witness statements from neighbors who were also displaced, photographic evidence, city planning minutes, everything your lawyers told you didn't exist." The mention of his legal team sent another wave of concern through Victoria. This wasn't some desperate individual making wild claims. This was an organized, methodical challenge to her empire's foundation. "What legal team?" she demanded. "You said you had a public defender initially." Thomas's smile held secrets that made her deeply uncomfortable. "I did have a public defender when I first tried to pursue this, but when the preliminary evidence review showed the strength of my case, several law firms became very interested in taking this on contingency. Apparently, there's significant profit potential in correcting a 7-year-old property theft." The word theft hit the crowd like a slap. Several residents exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware that they were living in a building that might have been constructed through coercion and exploitation. Dr. Robert Chin, a prominent civil rights attorney who happened to own a unit in the building, pushed through the crowd. His presence added another layer of legitimacy to Thomas's claims. Dr. Chun was known for taking on cases that challenged systemic inequality and corporate overreach. "Excuse me," Dr. Chun said, addressing Thomas directly. "Are you working with the Property Rights Defense Collective by any chance?" "Among others," Thomas confirmed, and Victoria felt her stomach drop. The Property Rights Defense Collective was a coalition of legal aid organizations with an impressive track record in historical property disputes. They didn't take cases unless they were absolutely certain they could win. "Interesting," Dr. Chin mused, his sharp legal mind already analyzing the situation. "Miss Sterling, I hope you understand that if these claims are substantiated, you're not just facing a property dispute. You're potentially looking at claims for unjust enrichment, fraudulent transfer, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages could exceed the current value of this property. The crowd's murmur grew louder at the mention of damages exceeding $200 million. What had started as entertainment was rapidly becoming a legal and financial catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane," she erupted, her polished accent sharpening with stress. "My company has operated ethically and legally for decades. We've created jobs, paid taxes, contributed to community development, with profits from stolen property," Thomas said quietly, but his words cut through her protestations like a knife. "Miss Sterling, your contributions don't erase the original injustice. They just prove how profitable that injustice was." The philosophical implications of Thomas's statement rippled through the crowd. How many development projects were built on coerced sales? How many luxury buildings stood on land taken from people who couldn't afford to fight back? The questions were uncomfortable but unavoidable. Marcus Johnson, an investigative journalist who covered housing inequality for the local newspaper, stepped forward. He had been visiting a friend in the building when the confrontation began, but now he sensed a much bigger story. "Mr. Gray," Johnson said, his recorder already running, "you mentioned that this isn't just about your family's case. Are there other families with similar claims against Sterling Development?" Thomas's eyes lit up with the passion of someone who had found their true calling. "Over 30 families, Mr. Johnson. The entire Riverside neighborhood development boom of 2015 to 2019 was built on property acquisitions that pushed out long-term residents. Most of those families didn't have the resources or legal knowledge to fight back. But documentation exists in city archives, in family collections, in community organization records that have been preserved." The implications were staggering. If Thomas's case succeeded, it could open the floodgates for similar challenges across Victoria's entire development portfolio. The economic and social transformation would be unprecedented. Jennifer Martinez leaned close to Victoria. "Ma'am, we have local news crews gathering outside. Social media is exploding. We need to make a decision about how to handle this before it gets completely out of control." But Thomas overheard her. "Running away won't solve this, Miss Sterling. The legal process will continue with or without you. The only question is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem." "What solution?" Victoria demanded, desperation creeping into her voice. "You're talking about destroying my company's reputation, potentially bankrupting us with legal claims." "I'm talking about completing your legacy," Thomas replied with surprising gentleness. "Your architectural vision created something beautiful here, but it was built on a foundation of injustice. I'm offering you the chance to fix that foundation instead of pretending it doesn't exist." The crowd had grown to include nearly everyone in the building. Residents stood alongside staff and delivery workers, all of them witnessing what felt like a historical moment. The collision of development and displacement, of progress and justice, of the past and an uncertain but potentially transformative future. "What exactly are you proposing?" Victoria asked, her business mind finally engaging with the practical realities of the situation. Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine whether this confrontation led to destructive litigation or unprecedented cooperation. He reached into his backpack one more time and withdrew a leather portfolio that looked far more professional than anything else he carried. "I'm proposing a partnership," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to suggest. The gathered crowd sensed they were about to witness something unprecedented, a proposal that could either destroy a real estate empire or transform it into something revolutionary. Thomas spread the contents of his portfolio across the leasing office's reception desk, revealing detailed architectural plans, financial projections, and community impact studies that looked like they'd been prepared by professional consultants rather than the homeless man. "What you're looking at," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. It is a vision for how Sterling Tower could become the first luxury residential building in this city to operate on principles of restorative justice and community partnership. Victoria stared at the documents as if they might explode. The plans were sophisticated, detailed, and surprisingly innovative, maintaining the building's luxury aesthetic while incorporating elements she never would have imagined. Community partnership, she repeated skeptically. What does that even mean in practical terms? Thomas pointed to the architectural drawings, which showed modifications to Sterling Tower's design. Imagine a building where 30% of the units are reserved for affordable housing, actual affordable housing at rates working families can afford, not the affordable luxury marketing nonsense, where the building's common areas include community spaces available to former Riverside residents, where a portion of profits fund neighborhood development programs. The crowd murmured with confusion and intrigue. The concept was so radical that most people struggled to understand what he was suggesting. "You're talking about socialism," one of the residents muttered, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than outright dismissal. "I'm talking about capitalism with conscience," Thomas corrected. Sterling Tower continues to operate as a luxury building, continues to generate substantial profits, continues to provide premium housing for people who can afford it. But instead of those profits disappearing into corporate accounts while the displaced community gets nothing, we create a model where everyone benefits. Dr. Chun leaned forward with professional interest. "Mr. Gray, are you proposing some form of community land trust arrangement?" "Exactly," Thomas confirmed. Sterling Development retains operational control and receives fair compensation for their investment and expertise. But the Gray family estate, representing the displaced Riverside community, becomes a stakeholder with oversight rights and profit-sharing arrangements. Victoria studied the financial projections with growing amazement. They were professional, detailed, and surprisingly sophisticated for someone who appeared to have been living on the streets. The model showed how community partnership could actually increase long-term profitability through reduced legal costs, enhanced reputation, and access to new funding sources. "This is incredibly complex," she admitted, her business mind engaging despite her emotional resistance. "The financing alone would require complete restructuring. The existing residents would have concerns. My investors would need convincing." "Which is why I need your expertise," Thomas said, surprising her again. "I don't want to destroy what you've built, Miss Sterling. I want to evolve it. You understand luxury residential development, property management, high-end marketing. I understand community needs, historical justice, and sustainable development. Together, we could create something that's never existed before." Marcus Johnson was typing furiously on his laptop. "Mr. Gray, you're essentially proposing to transform a symbol of gentrification into a model of community-centered development. Have you calculated the financial implications?" Thomas turned to another section of his portfolio, revealing detailed financial models that had clearly been prepared by professional analysts. "We have. The initial transition would require investment, but the long-term profitability could actually exceed current projections. There's a growing market for socially responsible luxury housing, wealthy people who want to live in beautiful spaces while also contributing to positive community outcomes." He pointed to specific numbers on the projections. "Plus, community partnership means community investment. Former residents become stakeholders rather than displaced victims. That translates to reduced security concerns, better relationships with city officials, positive publicity, and access to community development grants and impact investment funds." Victoria felt her worldview tilting. Everything Thomas was proposing challenged her fundamental assumptions about development, profit, and social responsibility. Yet the numbers were compelling, the vision was ambitious, and the alternative, protracted litigation that could destroy her company's reputation, was increasingly unappealing. "Even if I were interested in such a radical transformation," she said slowly, "my board of directors, my investors, my existing residents, they would never approve something like this." "They might, if you present it correctly," Thomas suggested. This isn't guilt-driven charity. This is innovative business strategy that positions Sterling Development as a leader in the next evolution of urban housing, luxury that serves rather than displaces communities. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. The legal benefits alone would be substantial. Proactive restorative agreements typically receive much more favorable treatment from courts than defensive litigation. You could potentially resolve not just this claim, but any similar claims that might emerge from your other developments, while positioning yourself as an industry reformer rather than a target. The crowd was beginning to understand the revolutionary nature of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a potential blueprint for how historical displacement could be addressed through innovation rather than destruction. What would this mean for my company's role? Victoria asked, surprising herself with how seriously she was considering Thomas's proposal. Your company retains management control and receives significant compensation for your expertise, Thomas explained. But the community becomes a partner with real oversight and profit-sharing rights. Think of it as stakeholder development rather than extractive development. Jennifer Martinez, who had been quietly reviewing Thomas's financial projections, looked up with unexpected interest. Ma'am, these numbers are actually impressive. The projected returns account for the affordable housing requirements, but show long-term profitability through reduced vacancy rates, lower turnover, and access to new funding sources we haven't tapped. Victoria's phone continued buzzing with urgent messages, but she ignored it. For the first time in this confrontation, she was seeing Thomas not as a threat to be neutralized, but as a potential partner offering genuine innovation. I need time to consider this, she said finally. These are decisions that affect hundreds of residents, millions of dollars in assets, and my company's entire reputation. Of course, Thomas agreed. But while you're considering, remember that transformation is happening whether we guide it or not. Cities across the country are grappling with displacement, gentrification, housing inequality. The question is whether developers will be leaders in creating solutions or targets of increasing legal challenges and public backlash. As he spoke, Thomas's evolution from dismissed vagrant to visionary advocate was complete. The crowd could see it. Victoria could feel it. And the implications were radiating far beyond Sterling Tower's lobby into a future that none of them had imagined possible. The marble floors and designer fixtures that had seemed like symbols of success now felt like artifacts of an outdated model, beautiful but incomplete, luxurious but morally hollow. I'll need to speak with my advisors, Victoria said, pulling out her phone with hands that trembled slightly. My legal team, my financial analysts, my board members, this is too significant to decide alone. Take the time you need, Thomas replied, but know that I'm not going away. My grandfather spent his final months in grief over losing the home he built. I've spent 4 years homeless while pursuing justice for what was taken from him. I can wait a little longer for you to make the right decision. The weight of his words, 4 years homeless while fighting for justice, hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had assumed his poverty was evidence of failure, but it was actually evidence of sacrifice, of prioritizing principle over comfort, of refusing to give up despite overwhelming obstacles. Where? She started, then hesitated. Where have you been living while pursuing this case? Thomas smiled sadly. Shelters when I can get a bed. Street corners when I can't. The irony isn't lost on me, Miss Sterling. I've been sleeping rough in the shadow of a luxury building constructed on my grandfather's stolen land. The shame that washed over Victoria was unlike anything she had experienced in her career. She had built her reputation on being a visionary, an innovator, someone who created beautiful spaces that improved urban life. But in this moment, she saw herself through Thomas's eyes, as someone who had benefited from an injustice and then compounded it by dismissing its victim. I think, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the now silent lobby, that we should definitely talk about that basement apartment you inquired about earlier. Consider it available rent-free while we work through the details of your proposal. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Thomas looked equally stunned by the offer. I don't want charity, he said firmly. If I stay here, I want to pay fair rent like anyone else. It's not charity, Victoria interrupted, her mind already working through the implications. Call it a good faith gesture while we negotiate our partnership. Call it acknowledgement that you have legitimate claims here. Call it whatever you want, but please don't sleep on the streets tonight while we figure out how to make this right. The transformation in Victoria's tone was remarkable. Minutes ago, she had been mocking Thomas's poverty. Now she was offering him housing in the building constructed on his grandfather's land. Dr. Chen smiled with professional satisfaction. Miss Sterling, what you just offered is exactly the kind of acknowledgement that turns adversarial litigation into collaborative problem-solving. Mr. Gray, I'd be happy to serve as a mediator if both parties are interested in pursuing a negotiated resolution. Thomas looked around the lobby at the faces watching him. Residents who had dismissed him minutes ago now looked at him with respect. Staff members who had wanted him removed now saw him as someone deserving dignity. And Victoria Sterling, who had mocked his poverty, now offered partnership. I'll accept the apartment, he said finally, not as charity, but as the first step in a partnership that could transform how this city thinks about development, displacement, and justice. The applause that erupted from the crowd was unexpected but genuine. People were witnessing something unprecedented. A confrontation that had started with mockery and humiliation was ending with acknowledgement and possibility. 6 months later, Sterling Tower had been renamed Riverside Commons, a name that honored the neighborhood it had displaced while pointing toward its transformed future. The building had become the most discussed property development in the country, featured in architectural magazines, business journals, and social justice publications. The transformation wasn't just symbolic, it was measurably revolutionary. Community partnership had generated unprecedented resident satisfaction, attracted wealthy tenants specifically seeking socially responsible luxury housing, and created a model that other developers were beginning to study and replicate. Thomas Gray had moved from the basement apartment to a modest 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor, which served as both his home and the headquarters for the Riverside Community Development Initiative. The organization operated out of beautifully renovated space that had once been reserved exclusively for wealthy residents' private storage. Victoria Sterling had become an unlikely advocate for community-centered development, speaking at conferences around the world about how acknowledging historical displacement could create better business outcomes. Her company's portfolio had been systematically reviewed, with community partnership agreements being negotiated for several other properties built on questionable acquisitions. Most importantly, the Riverside Commons model had been replicated in 8 cities, with the Property Rights Defense Collective using it as a template for resolving dozens of similar displacement cases. What had started as one homeless man's determined pursuit of justice had evolved into a movement transforming how development and community intersected. The building itself thrived under its new model. 30% of units housed working families at genuinely affordable rates. Community spaces hosted neighborhood meetings, art exhibitions, and job training programs. Former Riverside residents served on the building's oversight committee, ensuring that luxury and community benefit remained balanced. But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationships between residents. Wealthy tenants who had once viewed affordable housing as diminishing their property values now mentored young people from working-class families. Former Riverside residents shared neighborhood history with newcomers. The building had become what Thomas had envisioned, a place where different economic realities coexisted and enriched each other. On the 6-month anniversary of their confrontation, Thomas and Victoria stood together in the building's transformed lobby, preparing to address residents and media gathered to document the partnership's success. I never imagined that day would lead to this, Victoria admitted quietly. When you walked in here 6 months ago, I saw you as a problem to be removed. Now I see you as the person who saved my legacy. Thomas smiled. You saved it yourself by choosing transformation over defensiveness. That choice, to acknowledge rather than deny, to partner rather than fight, that's what created all of this. As they prepared to speak, Thomas reflected on his grandfather's final words. Don't let them erase us, Tommy. Don't let them pretend we never existed, that we never mattered. He hadn't let them erase his grandfather's legacy. Instead, he had transformed it into something that honored Henry Thompson Gray's memory while creating opportunities for countless others facing similar displacement. What if every confrontation with historical injustice became an opportunity for innovation? What if wealth was measured not by what we extract from communities, but by what we create with them? The Riverside Common story proves that acknowledging historical wrongs doesn't diminish our achievements. It completes them by ensuring they serve everyone, not just the privileged few. Whether you're facing your own moment of truth or witnessing someone else's courage, remember Thomas's words. Transformation is happening whether we guide it or not. The question is whether we'll be leaders or victims of that change. Choose leadership. Choose partnership. Choose the transformation that turns confrontation into collaboration and makes justice not just a legal principle, but a business model that actually works for everyone. Because somewhere in your city, the next Thomas Gray is waiting for someone to see their humanity instead of just their circumstances.